is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Do public school students in Detroit have a right to literacy? According to a recent federal appeals court ruling, the answer is yes. This is a potentially landmark decision that could have implications for similar suits nationwide. Joining us to discuss it is Jennifer Chambers of the Detroit News. She's been following the story since the case was first filed in 2016. We're also going to talk about covering the education beat from Motor City and how she's handling the economic upheaval in her own newsroom. Jennifer, welcome to EWA Radio.
Hi, Emily. Thank you.
Let's start at the top. Who are the plaintiffs here in this suit?
There are 7 school children who attended school in Detroit. That's a combination of students at Detroit Public Schools, which is the city's traditional district, and some of the students were from charter schools in Detroit.
And they're represented by a public interest law firm from California. Is that right?
Right. The LA-based firm Public Counsel represents the children. They are a national law firm, and they do a lot of education cases in which they allege the rights of children have been violated in some way with regards to what kind of education they've received.
And so this really is intended to be a test case of sorts.
It is. The attorneys in the case want to use the U.S. Constitution to establish a right to literacy for all children in the United States. And they filed the case in Detroit, where in 2016 conditions were quite deplorable. Students didn't have teachers in front of them in class for weeks on end. Buildings were filthy. They were either too hot or too cold. And kids had outdated textbooks. And the conditions were nothing like you would ever see in a school anywhere else, as far as I can tell.
And you've spent a lot of time in those classrooms.
I have. I've been to at least several dozen Detroit public schools, often led in by administration, where maybe they're working on a new program, but I have definitely been in schools where there have been leaky roofs, bad smells. I've had photographs from teachers of vermin in desks. Parents contact me quite a bit about what their child experienced that day in school, whether it was ceiling matter falling on them or being unable to eat lunch in a lunchroom because of some kind of a mold problem, or even open the windows in school when it's 90 degrees out.
There have been some lawsuits in other states, including recently in California, where families on behalf of their children have sued, but going through state court and challenging the right to literacy or an appropriate education under the state constitution. But this case was different in part because it went through federal court. Why did the plaintiffs adopt that strategy?
The attorneys made the claim, which is quite unique, that Michigan, through its governor, its state education department, violated their 14th Amendment equal protection rights. And that's found in the U.S. Constitution. So the Michigan Constitution only requires a free public education, where there are some precedents set in appeals courts about education, but the Constitution does not spell out a right, and the Supreme Court has not weighed in, and the lawyers want the Supreme Court to weigh in. They want to set a national precedent so children have an acceptable standard of education in Detroit and across the U.S. And acceptable is maybe not the right word, but a right to access literacy so they can participate in the democratic process, which has been mentioned a lot in all these appeals in this case.
Let's talk about what the conditions were in the Detroit School District at the time that this lawsuit was filed. Let's go back 4 years to 2016. I'd like you to give us a picture of what we would have seen if we had visited. And then I'm going to ask you, of course, what's changed. But let's start with what it looked like in 2016.
Sure. This case was filed in September of 2016. School had just started. But when you look at the filing, it reflects a district that had been worn down by years of emergency management, which is state control of a school district. In Michigan, we had an emergency manager law, which allowed our governor to step in and install a financial person to turn around financial problems in the district, but that person really did not address educational needs. So when the lawsuit was filed, the district had 7 leaders over 10 years. And these were not educators. They were not superintendents. They were financial experts. And over that time that emergency managers were in, they closed schools, they reduced staff, they cut programs, and they did not invest in the schools. And the state did not give the district any additional funds to deal with any problems. So the district was basically worn down and degraded. And by the time this lawsuit was filed, I think it had reached the point where parents and students and people who were cared about the district were ready to articulate that this was just not okay anymore and it was time to do something about it.
Have things improved? Have things changed? I mean, it's returned a bit to local control. Has that made a difference?
Yes, I would say in 4 years, things have changed, and there's been definitely areas of improvement. Nikolai Vitti came to the Detroit Public School District in May of 2017, not even a full year after this lawsuit was filed. And he spent the first year getting to know the district, its students, teachers, and buildings. And within that year, he saw immediately that there was a lack of systems in place. There was no consistent curriculum that even related to Michigan's Common Core standards. So within a year, he launched a plan and he gutted the curriculum in K through 8. He put on a massive campaign to hire teachers. And in the end, he installed a new literacy and math campaign at K-8, which last year resulted in double-digit test score increases on our state assessment. He's hired hundreds of teachers. He's been able to pay them bonuses. And he's working at the high school now to address a serious literacy problem there where we have a lot of kids graduating who are unable to read, fill out job applications, and other issues. But Vitti has made a point of acknowledging that the district needed a massive turnaround, but that the state control that it was under the last 10 years really is responsible for the crisis the district was in. And that's what this lawsuit is about. The district, the students, the teachers, the buildings were in crisis in 2016 when this case was filed.
Let's talk a little bit about what the settlement might look like. I mean, the Detroit superintendent and the head of the local school board want Governor Gretchen Whitmer to settle this case, which would be heading into its 5th year if they decide to challenge it. What would that settlement look like?
There isn't anyone saying exactly what it would look like. The students in their case are asking for the current schools, the system to be improved. They're not asking for any kind of back pay or compensation. But what that might look like is the state of Michigan has to come up with a settlement with the lawyers. The state of Michigan has the ability to change the way the district is set up. And what that means is the state bailed out Detroit Public Schools also in 2016 after this lawsuit was filed. They renamed the district Detroit Public Schools Community District and kept the debt with Detroit Public Schools. So Dr. Vitti runs Detroit Public Schools Community District. He has the students in the buildings, but the debt from taxpayers or the taxes paid goes to pay off debt. But Dr. Vitti cannot raise taxes to improve school buildings right now. He has no authority to do that. And the district has over $500 million in facilities needs, over 100 school buildings. So the state could allow him to borrow money, which would allow him to start fixing buildings, installing HVAC systems, and doing a ton of things that would make a huge difference in the physical environment of the kids. Another thing that the settlement could look like is installing more literacy coaches, more literacy support within the district. And that could look like more teachers, more literacy coaches, more books, more intense curriculum, more after school programs. And they also could work out a settlement where they increase teacher pay or teacher bonuses. A lot of experts say teachers are key to any district's turnaround. Even though Dr. Vitti has hired a lot of teachers since he's come into Detroit, we still have a teacher shortage in Michigan, and there's still a lot of unfilled positions in Detroit. And class sizes tend to still be larger. So smaller classes, more teachers, I think would be overall helpful. But at this time, the state has not signaled it's interested in settling. They've been quite silent since the appeals court ruled on April 23rd.
When you're writing about this case, how much of it is in your mind in terms of the framing and the context of what this lawsuit is about? I mean, it's not just about this one case. It's about addressing what people see as, the systemic and institutional racism that's contributed to what these schools became.
Absolutely. When you have a conversation about Detroit and Detroit schools, you have to acknowledge the fact that Detroit, its residents and its school children have been victims of disinvestment, of racism, and it has taken many different forms, from housing discrimination to racial discrimination to discrimination in terms of investing in schools. And I don't know that anyone can specifically say how that the district was discriminated against in a specific act, because in a legal setting, they usually are looking for something like that. But there's no question that even most experts in Michigan, anyone in Detroit who's followed the schools would agree that they've just been neglected for so long, and it became normal for people to go to schools where there were bugs, old textbooks, and no teachers, and that was considered normal for decades. And it seems to me that in 2016, after Mark Rosenbaum and his staff interviewed kids in Detroit, they say that these conditions shocked the conscience, that they just had never heard of anything or seen anything this bad in Detroit. And I think that as we move forward, I don't know what the state of Michigan will actually admit to in terms of its responsibility, but I think you can't deny that racism and just disinvestment, because Detroit is a city that has struggled. It has struggled for decades. It still continues to struggle, even though the downtown has been deeply invested in. Everyone has said repeatedly that the schools are like this last chapter that need to be fixed and turned around, and they really have been ignored still. Even now in the last 5 to 10 years, as the mayor has brought forward companies to invest in the city, businesses and restaurants, the schools still are waiting for someone to do something so they can also shine. And maybe this lawsuit will lead to a settlement that will allow that.
We're talking with Jennifer Chambers of the Detroit News about whether students have a right to literacy in the Detroit public schools. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thanks to everyone who's taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Jennifer, we're not recording this in a vacuum. Obviously, you're at home. I'm at home. Detroit school children, most of them right now are probably at home. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the midst of this pandemic. What's going on with Detroit schools?
Well, like all districts in Michigan, the district was required to come up with a distance learning plan after the governor shut all K-12 buildings on April 2nd. And Detroit did that. They were one of the first districts to come forward with a plan that outlined a daily schedule and structure for children in K through 12 by subject, and what they wanted kids to do at home and what they wanted their teachers to do at home. But one of the challenges in Detroit is that only 10% of the student population, which is 50,000 children, have reliable access to the internet or a device. So the district was faced with printing thousands of packets. They spent millions of dollars making packets available, but they did. They put them at school buildings where parents came and picked them up. But just last week, Dr. Vitti worked out an arrangement with the business community for a $23 million plan that would bridge the digital divide in Detroit and allow kids to get access to devices and have the internet in their home. And that's being worked out right now, since we have 5 to 6 more weeks of school.
Jennifer, you returned to the education beat full-time in 2017. Before that, you were on the federal courts beat for the Detroit News. Why did that turn out to be something of a happy coincidence here?
It was interesting and timely, because in 2016, when this case was filed, I was a federal court reporter, and it was my job to cover this case. And I had 3 or 4 years of experience covering K-12 schools for the Detroit News before that. So I knew a little bit about education. I knew what education should look like in a classroom from going to school. I have 2 kids of my own. I know what their schools look like and what they've been through. So as a federal court reporter, I was able to get to work quickly, talk to the experts, find people to talk about the case, find parents and more students, and do a fully developed report on it. And then I followed this case consistently since 2016, and I returned to the K-12 beat in 2017. And it's always been on my mind. I've gotten to know some of the plaintiffs in the case, and I've always made myself available to the state of Michigan to talk about it, but typically they don't discuss pending litigation, and I've never had a real conversation with them about this case.
I got to spend a couple of years on the courts beat, first in California, and I have to tell you, Jennifer, I loved it. Did you like being on federal courts?
Oh, I absolutely love being on federal court. It was fascinating and invigorating, because there are no cameras in there, so it's just you and your notebook. In Detroit, they don't allow cell phones either. They just started letting you use a cell phone. But when I covered the beat, it was all about you, your ability to listen during a case, follow a prosecutor out after, And the federal court building is located next to the Detroit News. So I would just run next door to file a story. I covered a variety of cases, from murders to civil cases to automotive emissions cases during my beat. But interestingly enough, during my time on federal court, I also covered the fraud case with Detroit Public Schools, where a school paper vendor took millions of dollars through principals and spent on his own money, Norman Shy. And we had over 14 Detroit principals go to prison in that case. And that was just a sad, tragic case as well, because principals are looked at as parents, as mother and father figures in Detroit schools. Some of them pay for funerals of their own students or family members of students. And to have them be in court crying and begging for mercy over stealing money was really, really eye-opening. It's never a dull moment in Detroit in terms of news, and being on the federal court beat and the school beat has been an excellent experience.
There's no shortcuts, obviously, to building trust with sources and getting known and building that respect. But what are some tips you might have from reporters who may be visiting communities or schools that are very different from their own experiences?
I would have to say that in order to get people to talk to you about their child, you do often have to establish trust and talk about why it's important to tell their story. And if a reporter is new to a community and maybe it's not an area that they have experience or knowledge about, I definitely feel like going to school board meetings, reading about your district in stories that your competitors are doing. You need to understand what's really going on at the ground level. And then you need to start, and we can't do this right now amid this pandemic, but you really need to hit the ground and go out into communities and go to schools. Board meetings are an excellent way to meet people in the community, meet students and parents, and do those follow-up phone calls. And then it just takes time to build that trust and establish trust. When I started covering Detroit schools back in 2011, I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never covered schools, but it wasn't hard to find red flags everywhere with this district. They wanted to create a new plan where they had 60 kids in a class and they called it a college lecture hall. And no one had written that story yet. And I did. And it was insane how much attention it got. So, and I also think fresh eyes on a school and a school district is very helpful. So I would probably, suggest those things.
What are some ideas for reporters who may be covering issues of equity and fairness more broadly? It may not be necessarily related to a literacy lawsuit. What are some stories you'd like to see people tackling?
Well, I can tell you places that I look when I'm looking for broader stories are organizations like the Education Law Center, who focuses on students' rights and what's going on in schools. And they're really tackling a lot of different issues you can see across cities and states. They're not singular issues. And I think that's a great way to sort of see what is going on and test the temperature nationally. The equity issue seems to me to be the most important issue to cover, but how you cover it and what the standard for equity is in your own state is different. In Detroit, this school district has probably the most glaring problems, but there are rural schools that are struggling and troubled. There's Benton Harbor schools on the west side of the state that almost got shut down by the governor. I think that you have to really do as much reading and research as you can and understand that there's more than just local small issues going on. And the word equity is a term that we're all writing about. We're all trying to understand what it looks like and what it means. In this case, in Detroit, we'll certainly be addressing that at some point.
I think that's a great point because really, what is literacy? I mean, what standard are you holding it to? We don't necessarily have a national definition. Is it reading at grade level? Is it passing a high stakes test?
Exactly. And in this case, doesn't set out to define what literacy is. The key word in these court filings is access to literacy. And the lawyers for the school children claim the kids were denied access because they weren't given teachers for weeks. They had textbooks that were printed before they were born. They had such terrible conditions that they couldn't sit in class. So the case talks about just being given the chance to become literate is all Detroit kids want. It doesn't say that literacy is measured by passing a third grade reading test at all. So it's just really that word access. And I think that the case definitely spells out why they believe they've been denied access.
Jennifer, you, like some other of your colleagues at the Detroit News, are going through a rotating schedule of furloughs right now as a cost-cutting measure. I want to talk a little bit about what that's like. And we should point out that this court case decision came down while you were on furlough. What was that experience like?
That was tough for me. I have been staying on top of this case by checking appeals court rulings on Pacer every month. I communicate with some of the plaintiffs now on a regular basis, the lawyers in the case. And I feel like my reporting has stood out for 4 years. And to have the news come down while I was on furlough really broke my heart. But the text that I got from the children's lawyer was, "We won. Call me." And so I was thrilled that there was some news and some development in this case and that they felt that they had something to talk about. But it was hard for me not to write about it. But my colleagues did a terrific job on the piece. I've tweeted that out so people can see it. And I look forward to covering it again. And when it comes back to Detroit, because that's what's happening. It's headed back to Detroit. It has to be scheduled for some hearings. But the order now is for the case to go before Judge Murphy and for the state of Michigan and the lawyers for the school children to either start working out a settlement or set trial dates and take the case to trial.
What's it like to be on furlough? I mean, it's in some ways, I guess it's an enforced vacation, but it's really not because you're not getting paid. And I imagine you'd rather be working.
Well, to be honest with you, the furlough came at a time where, since I've been home reporting for the news like everyone else, been at home since March 13th. We are working longer hours. We're writing more stories. The education beat during the first few weeks was a hot beat because they had not decided whether to close the schools. Then they did. So we wrote about plans, and there's been a lot of layers of education coverage. Being off for a week gave me a chance to rest and recoup. And I'm back now. I've already got a great couple enterprise pieces that I'm working on right now about what the future might look like with camps, summer schools, and the fall. And I'm ready to get going again. But I feel like it's a privilege that I was able to schedule a furlough time so it worked with my family. I am collecting unemployment in Michigan. They do allow that. So I know a lot of other people who are out of work completely and just their paper has closed, and my heart goes out to them. But the Detroit News has been very supportive.
I'm glad to hear that. We try to end the podcast on an upbeat note, and I do think that is upbeat, that a furlough, while unsettling, it sounds like you're making the best of a tough situation.
Yeah, I think so. We all need to rejuvenate. I'm also homeschooling my two kids. So that gave me some time to light a fire under them, get them on a tougher schedule, and see what they're actually doing and not doing. So life continues. It's a lot of juggling, but I'm still thrilled to be employed as a journalist, and Detroit is the best town to work in.
Jennifer Chambers is the education reporter at the Detroit News. Jennifer, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you, Emily. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you'd like to know more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.